family law has intensified in the recent decade with the formulation of the various practical and theoretical models. In my article, I will offer a liberal analysis of this issue, and I hope to illustrate the challenges that it poses for contemporary liberals. At the center of our discussion will be three perspectives through which liberals think about this issue or should think about this issue: the individual, the multicultural communal, and as a struggle over the public voice in political arena. And finally, I will try to use the debate over civil marriage in Israel that you asked in the first panel about it. So I will use it as a case study. So let's begin with the individualist perspective, which I would say that, which I would present in two versions. Let's say the first one, believe in total separation between civil and religious marriage. According to this perspective, civil and secular regulation of marriage and divorce in religious marriage should remain just as a personal affair of the believers. The law shouldn't recognize the religious aspect of marriage, even, and it goes to Brian and Michael issue, according to the extreme version of this perspective, even if there is clause in a contract or arbitration, then the law shouldn't enforce it because it contradicts the separation and the non-establishment, etc. The second individualist perspective begin in a similar way. It still thinks that basically the state should offer just civil and secular legal regulation of marriage and divorce. However, unlike the previous perspective, this perspective recognizes the significance of religious aspect of marriage and divorce for the personal experience of a reputation of the population, and it realizes that ignoring it to say, okay, this is just your personal issue, it is not something that the law should address. So this perspective understands that ignoring the religious significance of this institution may cause injustice and personal distress. For example, when you talk about polygamy. So if you say, okay, if you just not coming to the state to get license for the second marriage, so I don't care, as you mentioned, Michael, it is problematic, because if we think what's wrong in polygamy, it will, and if we think that polygamy or bigamy harem the women that are involved, so it will be the same even if the second marriage is not official marriage. If we think about cases of duras, if one is religiously married, but according to the civil law, she is divorced, and then the husband said, but if you want me to cooperate with the divorce, then you have to pay. So, according to the first perspective, it is not duras, because as a state will say, you are divorced. It is just your own stupidness that you feel yourself as a married person, but this perspective understands that as an individual, she felt that she needed this religious divorce, and that's why she's under duras. So this perspective ready to make some correction in the civil or secular regulation in order to take into account the fact that a religious marriage is significant to individuals. And as I want to develop in my article, it might be connected to the fact what is a constitutional right to marry. if constitutional right to marry is more negative one, something that says that the state shouldn't involve, so according to this perspective, the state shouldn't be involved in religious marriage. However, if there are positive contexts that as a state we think that marriage is important for people and we want to encourage this, then if there are people that religious marriage is a thing that fulfill this interest and these values, then we couldn't ignore it, and maybe we can think about religious marriage as a individual human right. So this is the second version of the individual perspective, and the law, according to this perspective, still will be secular, civil, but will make some corrections in the polygamy, get law, to rest things like this in order to take into account the personal meaning of religious marriage to some person. The second perspective goes beyond the first one because it understands that marriage might be important not just to individual per se, but sometimes to individual as part of a community. So, according to this perspective, religious marriage and divorce are significant not only for individual, they hold meaning for religious communities. It is part of their own identity. And for this reason, this model will say, okay, the main regulation of marriage and divorce will be civil and secular. However, alongside with the civil and secular regulations, the law will recognize certain autonomy for religious communities. It might be, as we talk about arbitration, maybe a freedom of contract, and it might, so the law should, of course, the law should authorize a religious tribunal to act as arbitrators, but in a strong version of this perspective, it will provide governmental support to religious judicial system for minority groups, because it recognizes how important it is to communities, so it will not be just purely a private mechanism, but it will be something that will be supported in a way by the state, maybe even supervised by the state. When we will come to our case Israeli study, I will show how what we call in Israel the parallel track model reflects this model. The model that says that when someone gets married, you have to choose if you want to go to the religious track or to the secular one. Now, I call this model a multicultural communal perspective because it received a lot of support from the multiculturalism streams that believes that liberal states should respect some autonomy to minorities and sometimes even to non-liberal minorities, and this expose this model to kind of internal dispute within liberalism, because if liberalism is focused more on neutrality, so you should just say to people, okay, you have to choose if you want to the secular track, if you want the religious track. However, if our multiculturalism is dependent on autonomy, on the value, on the positive value of autonomy, then it not just say, okay, everyone will choose whatever he prefers, but there are liberal values that stem from autonomy that we should insist. So usually we speak about, in another article I try to say that if you support multiculturalism from autonomy-based justification, like, for example, Raz, Joseph Raz as an example, so you have to insist on substantive freedom of choice, not just that in a formal way you can choose what you want, but that there is a real ability to decide if you want to opt in. and protection from exploitation within, especially in terms of gender equality. So this is very important because unlike the negative nature of the neutrality liberalism that say we have just to be sure that the state is not too much involved, in the autonomy-based liberalism, it is the opposite. The state has responsibility to create variety of institutions in general and spousal institutions specifically, but because the state has this responsibility, she also has responsibility to take care that it is not just, okay, now you choose, but that there is some, even if not all of these institutions should be fully liberalized, there are some minimum of gender equality, preventing exploitation that are preconditions for recognizing such autonomy or such a track. And the third precondition for recognizing such a track is the right to exit. So even if you choose this track, we must insist that from liberal or pluralist perspective, that you can also opt out. So this is the multicultural communal perspective, and as the first one, also it has kind of two versions, the more Zin neutralist and the more Zik of autonomy-based, which insist on these three limitations. And now I want to move to, I would say, the more innovative perspective, which is less known, the one that I call the public perspective. This third perspective is less known in the Western world and in liberal thought, yet I think that it guides the legal regulation in some Middle Eastern countries. And so, and I will confess that a lot of time I felt that the Israeli scholarship are too much influenced by Canadian, Australian, maybe American thinking about multiculturalism, which is not fit to Israel, and as I will tell shortly, today it is not even fit to American itself. And the multicultural perspective that we just talked has in mind the situation like this. There is, in Hebrew we have expression Baba Bait, which I don't know how to express it. It might be like House of Lord, it might be the hegemon. So we are the liberal, we are the hegemon in Canada, in Australia. We have some minority of non-liberals, and then we have to discuss with ourselves how far are we ready to provide them kind of autonomy in their own community. However, in the Middle East and in Israel, the true situation is not liberal hegemons that have to discuss whether they are ready to provide kind of autonomy to minority non-liberals, but a struggle between liberal and non-liberal about the public arena. And I will begin with the case of the non-liberal in the first, which say, look, as law and society all the time teach us, law is not just rules, it has expressive and educational function, and it reflects values. And the values of us as religious people or as non-liberal are totally different from the values of liberals in a lot of topics, including the values that we have about marriage. So why it is fair, in your opinion, that you, the liberal, will dominate the public arena, and the maximum that we might get is autonomy in our own community? No, we are citizens of this state, and because we are citizens of this state, we want to influence exactly as you. And then what becomes the real challenge, that given that the value inheritance to religious marriage compete with liberal values and at times undermine them, this perspective poses a challenge for contemporary liberals. Can the public sphere be shared? And this challenge is in two main aspects. One is philosophical. What are the criteria for liberal to compromise? Are there liberal principles that can say, look, if I was just liberals in this country, this is the shape of the marriage. Now I have to negotiate with non-liberals about abortion, about marriage. What are the rules? Is it just what I can get? Is it like a kind of a commercial negotiation? Or there are kind of hierarchy of liberal values that I can say about this I cannot compromise, about this I can compromise. The second issue is the issue of practical, which kind of negotiation we can do, how we create atmosphere of sincere negotiation in which everyone will try to say, this is really important for me, maybe you can give up on this issue. And this is a way that I think Israel should go, and as we all heard today, maybe even this perspective is more suited today to America, how we build the Supreme Court, how we build the public arena when both liberal and non-liberal want to control, so how we negotiate, how we get into kind of a compromise, and we have to develop theory about it and also practical tools to apply them. And I want shortly to see how the Israeli case and try to think about, and as you asked Ruth, I don't remember who asked Ruth about it in the morning, that Ruth focused on the current situation and asked, but what about civil marriage? I think that you asked about it. So in this aspect, I will fulfill what the answer to your question. So the current situation in Israel is something that cannot work from liberal perspective, religious restrictions on the eligibility to marry, mandatory religious marriage ceremony, orthodox religious hegemony, religious law preventing the possibility of ending the marriage, and gender-based inequalities in divorce law. So I think that from liberal perspective, the current situation in Israel is non-starter in any way. Now, as Ruth talked today, the Supreme Court, sometimes civil legislation, makes some alternative, and because I am short in time, I will not explain why these alternatives are not good enough from liberal perspective. Sometimes they even damaging the current situation. So what can be done? So in the current discourse in Israel, mainly there are three proposals regarding future civil marriage. One is an exclusively civil trade. According to this model, so religious marriage will become a personal issue. Maybe after the civil ceremony you can go to your church or your synagogue or whatever, but everyone will be subject just to civil marriage and civil divorce. The second proposal is a parallel tracks that say in the beginning you will have to choose if you want civil or religious marriage, and then you stick to your original choice, and both of them will be court of the state. This is very important. And the third one is that marriage will continue to be religious. However, there will be like spousal registry, civil union, some formal alternative for civil marriage. So let's try to evaluate the alternative according to the liberal analysis that I just offered. So it seems that it's very simple. that the original individualist perspective, of course, will support an exclusive civil track. Because if you remember, the first version of the individualist say religious should be just the personal issue of the believer, it is not the issue of the state, so of course it will support the exclusive civil track. If we take the second version of the individualists, then it still says that it will be just civil marriage, but with few corrections, like maybe kind of get law and duress, and it's forbidden on polygamy, but the basic still will have one exclusive system. I would mention even now the problem. The problem is that if this will be the case, then people will continue to get married in religious tribunals, and these tribunals, because they are now will become purely private, will be purely unauthorized by the state. So maybe the state will not enforce the arbitration, but people will be sometimes feel that they have to go to them because of community pressure, and no one will supervise about them. So if we really take into account the individualist experience of people, so there is a problem even from this perspective. Now, liberal pluralism seems to support the parallel track, okay? Because liberal pluralism say we want to enable everyone to choose something that suits his own community. So it is, as I even mentioned before, the parallel track is suited for this model, civil and religious. However, as I mentioned before, this might be problematic if we think about it from autonomy-based liberalism, because we have to be sincere with ourselves. Does the typical religious tribunals and law in Israel will stand on substantive freedom to choose, free exit? At least in Jewish law there is no freedom of exit, and both in Islamic and Jewish law there is no gender equality. So it is very problematic even for the pluralists to say that we are support the two tracks. So in a way we are stuck, because the individualists support the exclusive civil track, but then we was buzzed by the byproduct. And when the pluralist offers the parallel track, then we are stuck by our commitment to autonomy-based liberalism, so we are in a way stuck. And what about the third one? So the third one cannot be justified from pure liberal perspective, because from pure liberal perspective, then the minimum is two parallel equal paths. How you say why marriage would be just religious and the other will be different name? But if you are looking at it, if you are looking at it from compromise perspective, this might be a change. So even if it is not the ideal of liberals, maybe if we take into account that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and there are a lot of people in Israel that think that the fact that some law in Israel reflects Judaism, and especially the objection to formal marriage of Jews and non-Jews, etc., then maybe a political compromise could be that there will be one track called marriage, that it will be religious, but there will be other tracks that will be respected by the state, would get all the civil rights, and will be purely. And now I want to end with personal confession about my own job. When I was PhD candidate, then Justice Minister Yossi Beilin, which was very left and very secular, came to Bar Ilan University, and he met some faculty member, and I was just PhD student, but the dean then told him, maybe you want to meet one of our PhD students. He is doing something very surprising about secular regulation of marriage. And it was like 20 years ago. And then I met him, and I talked with him about the problems that I identify in the current situation, and then told me, okay, now we have 50 days to offer me solutions, because I came to do my job not to hear about problems, but about solution. And he told me, don't tell me civil marriage, because there is no political ability to do it. I want you to, as a religious person, to offer me something that you think that basically stand in the criteria of the halacha, of the Jewish law, and that religious people can live with it, but solve a lot of the problems that you just mentioned. And I came with the idea of the spousal registration. By the way, it's a funny issue. For me, I was sure that it will be also open to same-sex. And then he deleted it. Now you will deny. But then, just 20 years ago, he said, I want it to be similar to the real marriage, so I don't want it to include same-sex, because then it will sound so old and different. Anyway, this was the offer that I put on the table. From political reasons, finally it didn't work. This is the Israeli story. One time it didn't work because there was a war, and one time it didn't work because there was a peace process, but anyway, it doesn't work. And then, a few years later, I wrote an article called A Pluralist Vision of Marriage. And in my article, I tried to think from liberal perspective about how to regulate marriage, and my conclusion was that, as I just mentioned, that from liberal perspective, you can justify the parallel track just if it stands in the three criteria that it seems that the Israeli law doesn't stand. And of course, it cannot justify spousal registration and not married. So I was ashamed about myself. I thought to myself, what happened here? In the 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when I offer an idea that now that I think about it theoretically, it sounds unplausible from a liberal perspective. And then when I understand the difference. When I wrote my article as a liberal that think I am the hegemon, I am the baal habayit, and then I have as a hegemon to think what I am ready to do. But what the minister asked me is the third stage, not what as a liberal you are ready to do, but what should be kind of compromise, and this is totally different set of issues that we should see. Now write the new article about this criteria, and I would say one thing and then I stop, that a second move that a personal move that I did, that my mistake in the spousal registry was that I make kind of mediation, but without calling the parties themselves. So I talk with rabbis, I talk with secular people, and then I came like a startup nation. Israel is a startup nation, and say, okay, this is what they want, this is what they want. I have a solution that basically make good enough solution or feature for everyone. However, there is something in built-in consensus that means that it is not the engineer that makes the mediation in his own head, but you have to build a culture of building consensus and lead a social movement. And this is what I'm trying to do now in my own life. You mentioned that I'm part of the new center, and we are cooperating with a body called the Israeli Congress, which try to initiate atmosphere of building consensus from bottom up. And maybe in 5 years we can see if this might work. Thank you.